My name is George Shepard. I was a sergeant in the Size Containment Service for 9 years, and for most of that time, I believed what they told me about the people we hunted. I want to write down what actually happened, before the cold and the morphine finish what David started. We were not soldiers, not the way my grandfather had been a soldier. We wore black plate over thermal weave. We carried short-barrel rifles and forearm shock plates the techs called shields, and we drove unmarked carriers with frosted plates through cities that had forgotten how to ask questions. Our captain was a man named Williams. He had a parade ground voice, and eyes that never went anywhere they didn't already know the answer to. He briefed us the same way every time. The subjects are man-made. The subjects are unstable. The subjects, if cornered, will kill you and feel nothing. Bring them in. If you cannot bring them in, drop them where they stand. The first one I helped bring in was a woman named Franny. She had been working the night shift at a poultry plant outside the old refinery zone for 2 years, sending money to a sister she never visited. The file on her was thin, a single page. Subject female 29. Classified Charlie. Last confirmed manifestation, 4 years prior, in a stairwell behind a bar where a man twice her size had laid hands on her and had been found at the bottom of the stairwell with both his arms wrong. There was a photograph of the man's arms in the file. They were the wrong shape for arms. I remember looking at the photograph in the back of the carrier and thinking that the woman who had done that would be a problem to take in, and then we took her in, and she was not a problem at all. We took her in a parking lot under sodium lamps that turned the snow the color of weak tea. She had walked out the back door of the plant at the end of her shift with a thermos in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and she had seen the carrier and she had stopped, just stopped, and stood there in the snow. She did not fight. She lifted both hands and asked, very softly, if her sister could be told she had been transferred. Scott told her sure. Scott lied to a lot of people gently. I think it was the only kindness he had left. I watched her get into the back of the carrier, and I watched her put the thermos and the folded paper down on the bench beside her with the care of somebody who has been told they cannot bring anything where they are going. And I watched the door close on her, and I told myself she would be all right. Franny went into the truck and into the facility, and the file closed and we moved to the next name. That was the rhythm of it. Names on a screen, faces in a folder, the warm hum of the carrier heater, the cold tick of the radio. We told ourselves they were dangerous, and most of them never gave us a reason to think different because most of them never resisted. The few that did, we put down in alleys or in stairwells, and the report always read the same. Subject hostile. Force authorized. End of paragraph. My team was 4 men and me. Scott on long gun, Eli on breech, Joseph, the youngest, on comms and second rifle. Marco drove and watched our backs. We had been together long enough that we ate from each other's plates without asking. Eli had a daughter he never spoke about except after the 3rd drink. Joseph was getting married in the spring. Marco was saving for a cabin north of the lake line. Scott had no plans because Scott had stopped making plans the year his wife left. I had a son who lived with his mother in a city I had not been authorized to enter in 6 years. We did not talk about any of that on duty. On duty, we talked about exits and angles and the temperature of the engine block. The name that ended us came down on a Tuesday. Anna, last name redacted, 23. A welder's helper at a fabrication shop in a sub-city the map still called by its old industrial name. Classified Bravo. The intel said she had walked through a steel door in a back room 2 nights earlier, killed 2 men who had been trying to sell her false papers, and left through a wall the wall used to be. The wall had been 40 centimeters of poured concrete. I read her file in the carrier. Williams had clipped a photograph to the front, the way he always did, because Williams believed faces kept us honest. The girl in the photograph had short brown hair under a knit cap and a scar across the bridge of her nose and the kind of mouth that has not laughed in a long time. I closed the folder and looked out the window at the snow blowing sideways down the empty street, and I told my men to check their kit. We found her in a back lot off the freight road, kneeling in the gravel between a dumpster and a wrecked sedan, going through the pockets of a dead man. There was another one slumped against the dumpster with his neck at the wrong angle. She heard the carrier before she saw it. She came up off her knees in one motion, not panicked, just measuring. And when she ran north along the rail line because the rail line was the only direction we could not take the truck. Scott put a round into the gravel 2 meters from her heel to make her flinch. She did not flinch. She just changed her angle and put a freight container between her and the long gun. Eli and Joseph went after her on foot. Marco peeled the carrier around to cut her off at the end of the line. I followed Eli through the gap between the containers because that was my job. I caught up to them at a chain-link fence on the far side of the yard. Eli was on his back in the snow and his rifle was in 2 pieces beside him, and he was looking at the sky like he had been shoved by something that was not there. Joseph was just past him on his knees, gasping, his shock plate sparking against his own forearm. The girl was already over the fence. She did not look back. Eli sat up slow and spat blood into the snow and said, "She's not a Bravo. She's not even close." We picked them up and we got back in the carrier, and Williams came on the radio almost before we had the doors closed. "We knew," he said. "We have known for a few weeks. The classification was kept low to keep the operational picture clean. Find her. Bring her in alive if you can." The captain's voice never moved. It never moved even then. We sat in the carrier with the heater clicking and nobody spoke. I have thought about that minute a lot since. I have thought about what would have happened if I had keyed the radio right then and told Williams to send somebody else, that we were done. I did not key the radio. I checked my kit and I told Marco to drive. That is the part I cannot get around, not the things that came later. That minute in the warm carrier with the heater clicking and the choice I did not make. We chased her for 3 days. She was clever. She had grown up underneath this system and she knew how it watched, and she moved through the dead spots between the cameras like a fish through reeds. We tracked her through pawn shops and bus depots and a Sikh community center where an old man poured us tea and told us, very politely, that he had not seen anyone matching that description. And Eli later said he was sure the old man had been lying, and I told Eli to leave it alone. The old man had hands that shook when he poured the tea. He was not afraid of us. He was angry. I had not seen that look on a civilian in a long time. It stayed with me. The second day we found a duffel bag she had left behind in a coin locker at a freight yard. A change of clothes, a wool hat, 2 energy bars, a photograph of a young woman in a high school cap and gown, with a careful handwritten name across the back that was not her own. I held that photograph in my gloved hand under the truck cab light, and I looked at the careful handwriting and I thought about Franny's thermos on the bench. Joseph asked me what I was looking at. I told him nothing. I put the photograph back in the duffel, and I told him to log the bag and move on. The third day she almost got past us at a rail crossing on the north line. Scott had the long gun on her at 400 meters through the trees, and he had a clean shot, and the captain was in our ear telling us to take her if we had to, and Scott held the shot. I asked Scott later why he had held it. Scott said he had not had a clean angle. Scott was lying. Scott had had the angle. I think on the third day even Scott was starting to feel the shape of the thing we were doing. He never said so. He never would have said so, but he held the shot. We found her at last in the high country, in a rented farmhouse at the end of a private road, where the snow had drifted up to the porch rail, and the chimney was putting out a thin gray thread. We took the house at dusk, Marco on the road, Scott on the high ground with the long gun, Eli and Joseph and me through the kitchen door. The kitchen was warm. There was a kettle on the burner and a bowl of soup half eaten on the table, and a wool coat hung on the back of a chair. She was in the front room on her feet, waiting for us. She had heard the carrier coming a kilometer out. She did not run this time. I think she had decided she was tired of running. She stood with her hands open at her sides and she said, "You don't know what I am." I told her we knew enough. I told her to lie down on the floor with her hands behind her head and we would not hurt her. I meant it, I think, as much as I had ever meant anything I had said on duty. She did not lie down. She said, You don't know what's coming behind you. That was when David walked in through the back wall. I am going to try to describe him the way I saw him, because I have read what the file said about him afterward, and the file is not what I saw. The file called him an alpha. The file said he had been the first viable subject in the program and had escaped from the South facility in October and had since killed 9 other subjects across 3 districts. The file did not say what he actually was. The file did not say where the program had gotten him. What walked through the wall behind me looked like a man in a long dark coat. He was the right height for a man. He had the right number of fingers, but the air around him was wrong, the way the air is wrong above a hot road in summer, and there was a sound coming off him that was not a sound, a thin pressure in the back of the skull, like a radio tune just past a station. His eyes were full of something that was not light and was not dark. When he looked at me, I felt my back teeth ache. He raised one hand. He did not close it. Eli came off the floor and went into the ceiling and stayed there. There was a wet crack and Eli came back down and did not get up. Joseph fired 3 rounds into the doorway where David had been, and David was no longer in the doorway. He was at Joseph's shoulder, and he set his palm flat against Joseph's chest plate, very gently, the way you might touch a child on the head. Joseph went out the kitchen window backward, and the window was closed when he went through it. I was on my back in the front room with my rifle on the floor 2 meters from my hand. David stepped past me to look at Anna. She had not moved. She was staring at him the way you stare at something you have been told about your whole life and never believed in. He said her name. He said it the way a man might say the name of a tool he had been looking for. He said, "You are the last of them. You are mine." She told him to go to hell. He smiled. It was not a smile a person makes. It was a smile a person remembers other people making and tries to copy. He said, "I am going home, Anna. With or without the rest of you, I am going home." Then he looked at me on the floor and tilted his head and said, "You are very lucky, soldier. You are not on my list." He walked out the front door. He did not open it. The door was simply not in his way. I lay on the floor for a long time before I could move. When I could move, I crawled to Eli and felt for his pulse, and there was none. I crawled to the window and looked out and saw Scott coming down the hill at a dead run with his long gun over his shoulder. And beyond Scott, the carrier at the end of the road with the driver's door open, and Marco on his knees in the snow trying to push his own intestines back into his belly. Marco died before Scott reached him. Anna was still in the front room. She had not run. I have wondered why she did not run. I think she had nowhere to run to anymore. I think she had been running her whole life, and that night she had finally been seen by the thing that had been chasing her since before she was born, and there was no point in running from it any further. I sat up against the wall and I looked at her and she looked at me, and the kettle on the kitchen stove began to whistle. Williams came on the radio. He wanted a status. I keyed the radio and told him my team was dead and the Alpha had taken the subject. I told him the Alpha had walked out the front door and gone north into the trees. I did not tell him the subject was still in the room with me, sitting on the floor across from me with her hands wrapped around her knees and her eyes wet. Williams said, "Hold position. Recovery is inbound." I clicked off the radio. She said, "You should kill me. You should kill me and tell them he took me too." I asked her why I should do that. She told me what David was. She said the program had not made him. The program had pulled him. There had been a project 20 years back run out of a facility under a mountain in the south that had been trying to draw energy across what the scientists called a quantum membrane. They had succeeded once. They had pulled something across, something that on our side of the membrane wore the shape of a man, and they had caged it and they had taken samples. They had bred those samples into willing women. The women had died. The children had not. The children were the subjects. She was a subject. She was, she said, made from him. She said the others were too. She said he had been in the cage for 19 years, and last October he had opened the cage from the inside. And now he was killing his children one by one because every time he killed one of them, the part of him that was in them came back to him. and every time the part of him came back to him, the membrane on his side of the world thinned a little more, and when he had taken the last of them, he would step back through, and what he would leave behind on our side was anybody's guess. She told me there were two left, her and a man named Abel who lived under a different name in a port city 1,000 kilometers east. I asked her how she knew all this. She said because she had been inside the cage as a child. She said the program had taken her in at 4 years old after her mother died, and they had kept her in the room next to his for 6 years before they had let her out. She said she had heard him breathe through the wall every night of her childhood. She said the sound he made was not breath. I asked her what would happen if he went back. She said she did not know. She said she did not think he had been sent here on purpose. She said she thought he had been pulled by mistake and had spent 19 years trying to find the door back, and that whatever waited on the other side of the door had been waiting for him the way a wolf waits at the mouth of a den. I sat against the wall and I looked at my dead friends, and I thought about William's voice on the radio, and I thought about the captain's parade ground eyes, and I thought about Franny on the night shift at the poultry plant, and I thought about how many Frannas we had walked into the carrier over 9 years, and how many of them had been pieces of the thing in the long dark coat. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She said she wanted me to drive her east. She said she wanted to get to Abel before David did. She said if Abel and she could be together when he came for them, they might be able to hold him long enough for one of them to do what needed to be done. I asked what needed to be done. She said one of them had to die first, with the other one ready, so that the part of him that came back wrong, came back tangled and pulled him with it. She said she did not know if it would work. She said it was the only thing left to try. I stood up. My knees did not want to. I walked into the kitchen and turned off the burner under the kettle because the whistling was making it hard to think. I came back into the front room and I told her to get her coat. We took the carrier. I put Eli and Joseph and Marco in the back under a tarp because I was not going to leave them in that house. Eli was the heaviest. I had to drag him by the webbing on his plate carrier across the kitchen floor and out into the snow, and the heels of his boots left 2 parallel grooves in the snow that filled in behind me as I went. Joseph I carried. He was a small man. His helmet had come off going through the window, and I went back inside to find it, and I put it on his chest under the tarp, because it had felt wrong to leave the helmet behind. Marco, I had to leave the intestines where they were because there was no time to do otherwise, and I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether I could have done better by him, and I have not yet come up with an answer that lets me sleep. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the radio off and the road north and then east through a landscape that was nothing but white and gray and the black bones of trees. She slept against the window. She woke up sometimes and looked at me as if she was not sure I was still there. The heater clicked the way it had always clicked. The dashboard lights were the same dim green. The carrier smelled the way it had always smelled, of gun oil and stale coffee and the chemical sweetness of the seat foam, except now it also smelled, faintly, of the men in the back. And I rolled the windows down for a kilometer at a time every hour to keep my head clear. And the cold came in and turned my face numb, and that was all right with me too. We stopped once at a fueling station on a stretch of road where I knew the cameras had been down for 2 months. I filled the tank from the manual pump, and I went inside and bought 2 cups of coffee and 4 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a bottle of acetaminophen because my hands had started to shake. The woman behind the counter looked at me and at the carrier and at the tarp in the back through the rear window, and she did not say a word. She rang me up. She gave me my change. She said, "Drive careful," and I said I would, and I drove out of her parking lot, and I have wondered since whether she made a phone call when I was gone. I think she did not. I think she had seen carriers like mine come through her station for years, and she had finally seen one that did not look right, and she had made the decision the old man in the community center had made, and the decision Scott had made at the rail crossing. People were making decisions. I had not seen it until I was the one driving. I asked her, around dawn on the second day, why he had let me live. She said because David did not see soldiers. She said David saw only his children. She said to David I was furniture. I told her that was the first good news I had heard in 3 days. She almost laughed. It was not a laugh. It was the shape of a laugh, but it was the first one I had heard her make, and I held on to it. We crossed the eastern boundary on the 3rd night, through a checkpoint where the corporal on duty recognized my plates and waved us through without looking in the back. Williams had not flagged the carrier yet. I think Williams was still waiting for me to come in on my own. I think Williams had spent 9 years building me into a man who would come in on his own, and he was having trouble believing he had built wrong. The port city smelled of diesel and salt and old fish. Abel lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up over a noodle shop on a street where the snow turned to slush and stayed that way. He opened the door in a stained undershirt with a paring knife in his right hand, and he looked at Anna, and his face went through 3 expressions I did not have names for, and he stepped aside and let us in. He was older than I had expected, 40s maybe. He had been a school custodian for 11 years. He had a cat. The cat sat on the radiator and watched me the way cats watch men who have come into a room they were not invited into. Anna told him about David, about the others, about what had happened at the farmhouse. Abel listened with his hands folded in his lap. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right." He said it the way a man says all right when he has been waiting for a thing for a very long time, and now the thing has come and there is no point in arguing with it. He looked at me. He said, "Who are you?" I told him my name and my rank, and what unit I had been with. He said, "You killed Franny." I told him we had taken Franny in. I told him I did not know what had happened to her after. I told him I had read her file and I had read the others, and that I had been told they were dangerous and I had believed it, and that I was not going to pretend now that I had not. I told him I was here because the girl had asked me to drive her, and because I had nowhere else to go, and because if the thing in the long dark coat got what it wanted, I did not want to be on the side of the road that had given it to him. Abel looked at me a while longer. Then he nodded once and went to make tea. David came 2 nights later. We had not slept much. We had tried to plan, and the planning had been thin because there was nothing to plan with. Abel had told us what he could do, which was not much. He could move small things. He could light a candle from across the room. Anna could break a wall, but she could not break David because David was the wall. The thing they could maybe do together, Abel said, was hold him in one place for a count of 3, maybe 4. After that, he said, they would both be empty. I had my rifle. I had 3 magazines and a sidearm and the carrier downstairs and a head full of 9 years of watching men go down in stairwells. None of it was going to matter against David. I knew that. I had known it on the floor of the farmhouse. The question was not whether I could kill him. The question was what I could do in the 4 seconds Abel and Anna could give me. I sat at the kitchen table on the 2nd night and I thought about it. I thought about it the way I had been trained to think about a breach. Angles, exits, what the enemy expects, what the enemy cannot conceive of. Williams used to walk us through breaches the night before a job with a piece of chalk on a chalkboard, the way an old football coach walks through a play. The chalk made a dry sound on the board and Williams' voice never moved, and at the end of the briefing he would put the chalk down and say, "Gentlemen, the door opens, the work begins," and we would say, "Yes, sir." I had said yes, sir, to that man for 9 years. I had never once asked him what was on the other side of the door. David expected his children. David expected, maybe, more of my unit, more black plate and shock shields and short rifles, because that was what the program had sent at him for 19 years. David did not expect a soldier who had walked off the program. David did not expect a soldier who had nothing left to lose and was no longer interested in winning. I asked Anna where the South facility was, the one under the mountain, the one with the membrane. She told me. I asked her if the cage was still there. She said she did not know. She said the cage had been built around the spot where the membrane was thinnest. She said the membrane did not move. She said the cage might be empty now, but the spot would still be there. I asked her how far it was. She told me, 600 kilometers south-southwest, in country I had once been authorized to enter. I had a carrier with frosted plates and a tank full of fuel and a size access code. Williams had not yet revoked because Williams was still waiting for me to come home. I told her the plan. It was not much of a plan. It was the only one I had. She thought about it, then she said you would die. I told her that was already on the table. She said you don't have to. I told her I had 4 men in the back of the carrier who had not had to either. Abel was in the doorway listening. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from me. He said, if you do this, you go alone. He said, we cannot be in the carrier with you. He said, if he sees us with you, none of it works. I told him I knew. He said, you understand what we are asking you to do. I told him I understood. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, you are not what I thought you were, soldier. I told him I was not what I had thought I was either. David came through the wall at the foot of Anna's bed at 2 in the morning. He did not bother with the door. He stepped through the plaster the way a man steps through smoke, and the air in the apartment went thin and cold, and the cat on the radiator went straight up the curtain and out the open transom window, and I have wondered since whether the cat survived. I hope it did. It is a small thing to hope for. I hope it anyway. Anna was ready. Abel was in the next room. I was in the kitchen with the rifle across my knees and the carrier keys in my left hand. She stood up out of the bed in her clothes and she said his name, the way you say the name of a thing you have decided to stop being afraid of. And David smiled his copid smile, and Abel walked into the room behind him. The two of them did what they had said they could do. They held him. It was not a fight. It was not a thing my eyes could properly track. It was a stillness in the middle of the room, a stillness so heavy the floorboards creaked under it, and David in the middle of the stillness with his mouth open and his hands at his sides and the air around him going the wrong color. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4. On 4 I was out the door and down the stairs with the rifle over my shoulder. I heard Abel's voice behind me, not a word, just a sound, the sound of a man pouring out the last of what he had. I did not look back. I had been told not to look back. I went down the stairs and into the carrier and I started it and I drove. I drove south. I drove for 10 hours, on roads that got worse and emptier, and finally became no road at all. Just a service track up into the foothills where the snow was deep enough that the carrier ground its belly on the high points. The radio was full of Williams. Williams calling me by my name. Williams calling me by my rank. Williams telling me he understood that I had been through a hard thing, that I should bring the asset in, that there was a place for me on the other side of this. I let him talk. He had a good voice for the radio. He always had. Around hour 7 he stopped talking like a captain and started talking like a man. He told me about a son I did not know he had, in a city I had not been authorized to enter in 6 years. He told me my son's name. He told me where my son went to school. He did not threaten my son. He did not have to. He just said the name and the school and let the radio go quiet, and I drove. I drove and I thought about how long Williams must have been keeping that name in a drawer, in case I ever stopped being the kind of man who said yes, sir. I thought about how many drawers like that Williams had. I thought about Franny's sister. I kept driving. The country south of the lake line is country I have not seen anyone else describe properly. It is not a wilderness. It is a thing that has been used up and walked away from. Pump houses with their roofs caved in. Long straight roads that go to nothing in particular. Old fences with the wire gone slack and the posts leaning. The mountain itself, when I finally saw it, was not a mountain the way the mountains in the north are mountains. It was a low brown hump in a long brown plain, with a fence around its foot that had not been maintained in 20 years, and a road switchbacking up its flank that the snow had nearly swallowed. There was nothing on the road. There had been nothing on the road for a long time. The program had been ashamed of what it had done under that mountain, and the men who had built it had not come back to look at it, and the men who had paid for it had filed it under a different name and forgotten. I knew David would come. I knew he had to come. Anna and Abel had not killed him. They had only delayed him, and they had emptied themselves doing it, and somewhere behind me in the port city, the two of them were sitting in an apartment unable to lift a teacup between them, waiting to find out if I made it. He came when the road ended. I was 3 kilometers below the facility when I saw him in the rear view, standing in the middle of the snow behind the carrier, not running, just there. He had not been there a second before. The thing about David was that the space between where he had been and where he was next was a space the rest of us did not get to see. I drove faster. The carrier bottomed out twice. The third time it stopped. I got out with the rifle and the sidearm and the keys and I started walking. He let me walk. I think he was curious. I think for 19 years no one had ever walked toward him on purpose, and he wanted to see what kind of animal would do that. The facility was where she said it would be, half buried in the mountain. A door blown out from the inside 19 years ago that nobody had ever come back to close. Lights still on in the corridor beyond, on a circuit I did not understand, the way the lights stay on in deep places long after the people have left. I went in. The corridor had been white once. There were stenciled numbers on the bulkheads and stenciled arrows on the floor, and the arrows pointed deeper into the mountain. There were rooms off the corridor with their doors hanging open. I looked into one of them as I passed. It had been a child's room. There was a small bed bolted to the floor and a small chair bolted next to it, and a single drawing taped to the wall in crayon of a house with a sun over it. The drawing was at the height a child's hand would have reached. The tape had yellowed, but the drawing had not faded because there was no sunlight down there to fade it. I did not stop. I kept walking. I thought about Anna at 4 years old in that room. I thought about her hearing him breathe through the wall every night. I thought about the careful handwriting on the back of the photograph in the duffel bag. I kept walking. He followed. The cage was at the bottom of a long stair. It was not a cage the way a cage is a cage. It was a room with no walls, a circle of black floor under a low ceiling, and in the center of the circle the air was wrong, the way the air had been wrong around David at the farmhouse, only larger and older and not interested in me at all. I stood at the edge of the circle and I looked at it. I have looked at a lot of things in my life. I had never looked at anything like that. I heard him on the stair behind me. I did not turn around. I did not want him to see my face. I do not know why. It was a soldier's instinct, maybe. You do not give the enemy your face if you can help it. I stepped into the circle. The air took me. I cannot describe it any other way. The air took me and it lifted me a little off the floor and it began, very slowly, to pull. I felt the pull in my teeth and in the small bones behind my ears. I felt the membrane she had told me about, and it was not a wall. It was a skin, a thin live skin between this side and the other side, and I was being pulled into it. I had the sidearm in my right hand. I had the carrier keys in my left. I dropped the keys. I did not need them anymore. David came down off the stair fast then. He came down off the stair like a thing that has finally understood. He came across the floor and into the circle after me, and the membrane took him too, because the membrane had been waiting for him all this time, and it knew his shape better than it knew mine, and it pulled him in harder. He reached for me. He reached for me with both hands, and his face was no longer a copied smile. It was something else, something with no name in any language I have ever spoken, and I put the sidearm under his chin and I fired. It did not kill him. I had not expected it to. But it knocked his head back and it tangled him for 1/2 second in the pull, and in that 1/2 second I locked my arms around his chest the way Eli had taught me to lock up a man twice my size, and I held on. I held on while the membrane opened. I held on while the cold on the other side of it came through and went into my lungs and took the air out of them. I held on while the thing I had been holding stopped looking like a man at all. The last thing I remember of that side of the membrane was the lights in the corridor behind me going out, all at once, like someone had shut a book. I do not know how long I was on the other side. I do not have words for what was on the other side. I do not think I was the one on the other side. I think the part of me that came back is not all of me. There is a piece of me still over there with him, holding on, because the part of him that came across him on this side is still here in me, and the two parts will balance each other until the day I die, which the medics tell me will be soon, and which I am all right with. What I know is this. I came back through the membrane alone. The membrane closed behind me. I crawled up the stair on my hands and knees because my legs were not working and my mouth was full of blood, and the lights in the corridor came back on as I climbed. I walked out of the facility into the snow and I sat down against the carrier and I waited. Williams found me 4 hours later. He came up the service road in a personnel transport with a recovery team and a medic and a man in a suit I had never seen before. They put me on a stretcher. The medic put a needle in my arm. The man in the suit asked me where the Alpha was. I told him the Alpha was home. He asked what that meant. I told him to go look for himself if he wanted to know, but to bring a coat. William stood at the foot of the stretcher and he looked at me a long time. Then he said, "Sergeant, what did you do?" I told him I had done my job. I told him I had been sent to bring in a subject and I had brought one in. I did not say which one. He did not say anything. He had the parade ground eyes and they did not move. But there was something behind them, finally, that was moving, and I think it was the thing he had spent 9 years not letting anyone see. They took me to a facility. They asked me questions for 6 weeks. I told them the truth, the parts of it that mattered. I told them about the membrane and about David and about how to close the door, in case the door ever opened again, in case there was ever another program under another mountain with another set of scientists who thought they could reach across and take something that was not theirs. I told them everything except Anna and Abel. I told them Anna and Abel had died at the apartment, that David had taken them before he came for me. I do not know if anyone believed it. I do not think anyone wanted to look hard enough to disprove it. They let me go in the spring. Honorable discharge, full benefits, a pension I did not ask for, and a clinic I have been visiting twice a week ever since for the thing that is wrong with my blood that the doctors do not have a name for. The doctors say 6 months, maybe 9. I am writing this in the 4th. I had a letter last month from a port city 1,000 kilometers east. There was no return address. There was a photograph in it. A woman with short brown hair and a scar across the bridge of her nose, standing on a pier with an older man and a cat. The cat was on the man's shoulder. The woman was almost smiling. On the back in pencil, in a hand I did not recognize, it said, "The kettle is on. Come east when you are tired." I am tired. I am going to go east when the snow breaks. I do not know what I am anymore. I am not what Williams made, and I am not what David left in me. I am a man who drove a truck 600 kilometers with 4 dead friends in the back and walked into a hole in the world and held on. That will have to be enough. I think about Franny sometimes. I think about the parking lot under the sodium lamps and her sister she never visited. I think about Eli on the ceiling and Joseph going through the closed window and Marco on his knees in the snow. I think about Anna in the front room of the farmhouse with the kettle whistling behind her, telling me I did not know what I was looking at. She was right. I did not. I do now. The thing I want to put down here before the morphine, before the snow breaks, before any of the rest of it is this. They told us the subjects were dangerous. They told us we were the line between the dangerous thing and the world. They were lying about which thing was which. The dangerous thing was never in the carrier. The dangerous thing was the men who built the cage, and the men who paid for the cage, and the men who taught us not to ask what was inside the cage. The thing in the cage was just an animal a long way from home. And the thing in the cage had children, and the children had names, and the names had been on a screen. We are very good at putting names on a screen. It is the thing about us that the men who built the cage relied on for 19 years, and it is the thing about us that very nearly let David walk back through the membrane with our world balled up in his fist. But we have one other thing, and I did not understand it until I was on the floor of the farmhouse, and I want to put it down before I forget. We are also the animal that, when shown a name on a screen and told to bring it in, will sometimes look at the name long enough to see the face behind it, and the face behind the face, and the thing the men who put the name on the screen did not want us to see. We are slow, we are stubborn. We take 9 years to wake up and 4 of our brothers to die. But when we wake up all the way and we drive south, and we walk into the hole and we hold on. I held on. That is the last true thing I have to say. The rest is just waiting for the snow to break.